I once met a man who thought he was living freely because he could do whatever he wanted. Each morning, he woke without discipline. He ate what tempted him. He avoided difficult conversations. He chose comfort over growth, pleasure over purpose, distraction over depth. And do you know what he told me? He said he felt like a prisoner. Not to chains or walls, but to something far more terrifying, to a self he didn't recognize and couldn't respect. This is the great paradox I discovered in my decades of studying the human psyche. We think freedom means doing whatever we feel like doing in any given moment. But that kind of freedom creates the weakest, most fragmented version of who we are. Real freedom, the kind that builds a self you can actually stand inside of with pride, comes from something entirely different. It comes from the small, seemingly insignificant choices you make when no one is watching. It comes from the moments when you could go left toward ease, but you choose to go right toward who you want to become. Every single day, you stand at a crossroads. Most people don't even notice it's there. It doesn't announce itself with trumpets or drama. It's quiet. It's in the morning when you decide whether to get up or hit snooze again. It's in the afternoon when you choose between speaking your truth or swallowing it down. It's in the evening when you pick up your phone for the 17th time or finally sit with your own thoughts. These moments feel small, inconsequential, but I'm telling you, with everything I've learned about how the psyche forms itself, these moments are everything. Because you are not building yourself through the big, dramatic decisions alone. You are building yourself through the accumulated weight of 1,000 tiny choices. Each one is a vote. A vote for the person you're becoming. And here's what most people never realize. The self you want, the integrated, powerful, authentic self, doesn't arrive through luck or inspiration or perfect circumstances. It arrives through repetition, through choosing, again and again, the harder right over the easier wrong. Think of it this way. Every time you face a choice between comfort and growth, between avoidance and confrontation, you're not just making a decision for today. You're casting a vote for the kind of person you're becoming. And the self? The self is listening. The self is tallying those votes. You want to be confident? You don't wait until you feel confident. You act as if you already are, and you do it so many times that the psyche has no choice but to reorganize itself around this new pattern. The feeling follows the action. Always. Not the other way around. This is where people go astray. They wait for permission from their emotions. They think, once I feel brave, I'll do the brave thing. Once I feel motivated, I'll start the work. But that's backwards. That's the ego negotiating with shadows, trying to make a deal that will never come through. The self emerges through behavior. Through what you actually do when no one's watching. Through the small, unglamorous repetitions that no one will ever applaud. You practice showing up when you don't feel like it. You practice speaking your truth when it's uncomfortable. You practice sitting with anxiety instead of numbing it. And slowly, so slowly you might not notice at first, you become someone else. Someone more whole. I've watched this happen countless times in my work. A patient comes to me fragmented, at war with themselves, unable to make a decision without collapsing into doubt. And we don't solve this through insight alone. We solve it through the gradual, patient practice of integration. Small choices. Small confrontations with the shadow. Small moments of refusing to abandon oneself. 6 months later, they return. And something has shifted. Not because they had an epiphany. Not because they found the perfect technique or read the perfect book. But because they repeated the pattern of choosing themselves, over and over, until it became their new nature. This is the real work. Not the dramatic transformation. Not the lightning bolt of enlightenment. But the quiet, steady accumulation of choices that align you with your deeper self. And make no mistake, this is revolutionary. In a world that constantly asks you to fragment yourself, be professional here, be acceptable there, hide this part, perform that part, the simple act of becoming whole is an act of rebellion. It changes everything about how you move through the world. I've watched this transformation countless times, in my patients, in myself. A man walks into my office carrying the weight of expectations his father placed on him 40 years ago. He's successful by every external measure. Yet he feels hollow. He describes his life as though he's reading someone else's biography. We begin the work. Not affirmations. Not positive thinking. The hard work of looking at what he's buried. And slowly, something shifts. His posture changes first. Did you notice that? The body knows before the mind admits it. He stops apologizing for taking up space. He makes a decision his father would have hated, and instead of the catastrophe he'd imagined, he feels lighter, more present. This is what integration looks like in practice. You stop performing your life and start inhabiting it. The energy you spent maintaining the mask, suppressing the shadow, running from yourself, it becomes available for actual living. For creativity. For love. For the work only you can do. And here's what surprises people most. You don't become selfish. That's the fear, isn't it? That if you stop pretending, stop accommodating, stop shrinking yourself, you'll become some kind of monster. But the opposite happens. When you're no longer at war with yourself, you have genuine empathy for others. Not the performance of niceness, but real compassion born from understanding your own complexity. The integrated person can hold contradiction, can sit with ambiguity, can say, I contain this, and both are true. This is psychological maturity, not the airbrushed version we see on social media, but the textured, complicated, fully human version. Think of it like this. Before integration, you're a house with locked rooms. You live in the acceptable spaces and pretend the others don't exist. But you can feel them. They drain your energy. They haunt you. Integration is unlocking every door, walking through every room, and finally understanding that it's all your house. Every room belongs. Some rooms are difficult, some hold pain, but they're yours, and hiding from them only gives them power. Walking through those rooms, you begin to understand something profound. The parts of yourself you've rejected don't disappear. They gather strength in the darkness. They become distorted, exaggerated, more powerful than they ever were in the light. I remember a patient who came to me, a successful businessman, respected in his community. He presented himself as entirely rational, controlled, above petty emotions. Yet he suffered terrible nightmares. Dreams of being chased by a wild, violent man. Dreams where he was drowning in chaos. In our work together, we discovered what he'd locked away. As a young man, he'd been passionate, creative, even reckless. But his father had mocked these qualities as weakness. So he buried them. He built his identity on being the opposite, disciplined, logical, unmovable. But that passionate young man didn't die. He lived on in the shadow, growing more extreme in his exile. The creativity became chaos. The passion became rage. And every night, in dreams, this rejected part of himself came calling, demanding to be seen. This is what happens when we refuse integration. The qualities we exile become monsters in the basement of our psyche. They don't stay small and manageable. They grow teeth. You might recognize this in your own life. Perhaps you've prided yourself on being kind, patient, never angry. Yet sometimes you feel a rage so disproportionate it frightens you. That's not because you're secretly a terrible person. It's because anger, when completely rejected, becomes explosive. Or maybe you've defined yourself as strong, independent, needing no one. But in vulnerable moments, you feel a desperate neediness that makes you recoil from yourself. That's the exiled part of you that still needs connection, still needs care, grown distorted by years of denial. The shadow doesn't ask politely to be integrated. It erupts. It sabotages. It creates the very situations we've spent our lives trying to avoid. And here's what makes this truly challenging. The shadow often appears wearing the face of others. We project our rejected qualities onto the people around us. The traits we hate most in others? Usually the ones we've refused to acknowledge in ourselves. That colleague who always seems controlling. They're showing you the part of yourself that wants to grip life tighter but feels it shouldn't. That friend whose neediness drains you. Look closer. Where have you locked away your own need for connection, telling yourself independence is strength? This is how the shadow operates in the world. It doesn't just sit quietly in the basement of your psyche. It walks around disguised as other people's flaws. The mechanism is brilliant in its cruelty. You get to feel righteous, superior even, while remaining completely blind to your own darkness. I've watched this pattern repeat itself thousands of times. The person who rails against dishonesty in others, who cannot stand even small lies, often carries massive self-deception. They've lied to themselves so thoroughly about who they really are that they must hunt down dishonesty in everyone else. It's the only way they can touch that rejected part of themselves without having to own it. The most violent reactions tell you where your shadow lives. Whatever makes your blood boil, whatever triggers that disproportionate rage, that's where you need to look. Not at them, at yourself. But here's what makes this particularly painful. These projections aren't completely false. That's the trick. The other person does have that quality. You're not hallucinating. Your controlling colleague probably is controlling. Your needy friend probably is needy. But your intense emotional reaction, that charge you feel, that's all yours. That's the shadow waving at you through the mirror. You can observe traits in others calmly, dispassionately. But when you hate them, when they disgust you, when they make you want to destroy that person, you found your shadow. The reaction is the clue. The intensity is the evidence. And relationships become the battlefield. Marriages especially. You think you chose your partner consciously. You think you knew what you were doing. But the unconscious had its own agenda. It chose someone who would perfectly carry your projections. Someone whose flaws would mirror your shadow so precisely that you'd be forced, eventually, to look at yourself. This is why intimate relationships grow painful. Not because you chose wrong. Because you chose exactly right. The unconscious set up the perfect confrontation. It needed you to collide with that person, that situation, that failure, not to punish you, but to initiate you. The collision is the curriculum. This is the part most people refuse to accept. They want spirituality to be gentle. They want growth to arrive in soft light and whispered insights. But the psyche doesn't work that way. The psyche is an alchemist, and alchemy requires fire. You meet someone who drives you mad with envy. The unconscious arranged it. You lose the job you poured your soul into. The unconscious withdrew its support. You fall into a depression so thick you can't see your own hand in front of your face. The unconscious pulled you down into its waters, because there's something down there you've been refusing to see. And here's what makes it unbearable. You can't skip it. You can't think your way out. You can't meditate past it or affirm it away. The only way through the initiation is through the initiation. I watched this with my patients for decades. A man would come to me, successful by every outer measure, and he'd say, "I don't understand. I've done everything right. Why do I feel so empty?" And I'd look at him and see immediately. He'd never met his shadow. He'd built an entire life around being good, being admirable, being correct. And his soul was dying of starvation because he'd exiled half of himself. So what does the unconscious do? It arranges an affair, or a scandal, or a sudden, inexplicable rage that destroys something he values. Not as punishment, as rescue. The unconscious would rather see you whole than see you safe. It would rather drag you through hell than let you live a half-life in comfort. This is what people don't understand about the psyche. It has no interest in your happiness. It has interest only in your completeness. And completeness, my friend, is often indistinguishable from suffering. You see this most clearly in the dreams that won't leave you alone. The recurring nightmare that visits you year after year. The symbol that appears in different forms but carries the same terrible weight. These are not random misfires of a tired brain. These are messengers from the parts of yourself you have refused to acknowledge. I have sat with patients who dreamed of drowning, night after night. And when we traced the symbol back to its source, we always found the same thing. Someone who had learned to suppress their emotions so completely that the unconscious had to create an internal flood to compensate. The psyche speaks in the language of water when we have become too dry, too rational, too controlled. It speaks in fire when we have become too cold, too distant, too afraid of our own passion. It speaks in falling when we have climbed too high and forgotten where we came from. The dream is always precise. It is never arbitrary. And it will repeat itself with increasing intensity until you finally pay attention. This is what I mean when I say the unconscious is compensatory. It does not simply reflect your conscious attitudes, it counterbalances them. If you live entirely in your head, your dreams will drag you into your body. If you present yourself to the world as endlessly agreeable, your shadow will show you images of violence and rage. If you believe yourself to be a purely rational creature, you will be haunted by visions that make no rational sense whatsoever. The psyche insists on wholeness. It will not let you amputate half of your humanity and call it progress. And here is what makes this process so unbearable for most people. The unconscious does not care about your timeline. It does not care that you have a mortgage, a reputation, a carefully constructed identity that took decades to build. It will tear all of that down if necessary to get your attention. I have watched it happen countless times. The successful businessman who suddenly cannot get out of bed. The devoted mother who finds herself consumed with fantasies of running away. The respected professor who begins drinking alone in the afternoons. These are not random breakdowns. These are the psyche's desperate attempts to force an encounter with what has been ignored. The body knows before the mind admits. I observed this pattern countless times in my practice. A woman develops mysterious stomach ailments, doctors find nothing wrong. Yet when we explored her dreams, we discovered she had swallowed her voice for 15 years in a marriage built on silence. The stomach, you see, was rebelling against what she had been forced to digest. A life unlived, words unspoken, a self suppressed. Modern medicine calls these psychosomatic symptoms, as if to diminish them. But I tell you, there is nothing merely psychological about them. The psyche and soma are one. When you betray your inner truth, your body becomes the battlefield. I remember a young man who came to me with chronic back pain. 32 years old, bent like an old tree under invisible weight. Specialists had examined him, nothing structurally wrong. But I asked him a different question. What burden are you carrying that isn't yours? He broke down immediately. His father's failed business, his mother's unfulfilled dreams, his brother's addiction. He had made himself responsible for everyone's suffering, carrying loads that would break 3 men. The shadow doesn't just create psychological symptoms. It creates physical manifestations. The anger you refuse to feel becomes the tension in your jaw, the chronic headaches, the grinding teeth at night. The grief you won't allow yourself becomes the weight in your chest, the shallow breathing, the perpetual fatigue. Your body is trying to speak what your consciousness refuses to hear. And then there are the accidents. What we dismissively call bad luck. But I stopped believing in random accidents long ago. The man who keeps getting injured on the job, always in ways that prevent him from pursuing the career change he's terrified to make. The woman who repeatedly sprains the ankle that would carry her away from the relationship she knows is destroying her. The psyche has its ways of enforcing what consciousness denies. Pay attention to your recurring physical complaints. They are not random. They are symbolic communications from depths you've refused to acknowledge. The migraine that arrives before important meetings, the chronic back pain that emerged after you stopped standing up for yourself, the digestive issues that coincide with relationships you cannot stomach. These are not merely physiological events. They are messages written in the language of flesh. I witnessed this repeatedly in my practice. A successful businessman came to me with debilitating chest pains. Every medical examination found nothing wrong. Yet the pain persisted, always intensifying when he prepared to attend his father's company board meetings. His body was screaming what his consciousness refused to admit. He was living his father's unlived life, crushing his own heart's desires beneath the weight of inherited expectations. When we finally confronted this truth, when he acknowledged the artist within him that had been suffocated by corporate obligations, the chest pain ceased within weeks. The body no longer needed to shout because consciousness had finally learned to listen. Your shadow does not only speak through dreams and symptoms. It broadcasts through your harshest judgments of others. Show me what you despise most intensely in other people, and I will show you what you have disowned in yourself. This is perhaps the most uncomfortable truth I can offer you, yet it is also the most liberating. The colleague whose assertiveness you find aggressive, could it be that you have buried your own healthy aggression, your own right to take up space? The friend whose vulnerability you perceive as weakness, might you be projecting your own fear of being tender, of being seen as less than invincible? We do not react neutrally to the qualities we have successfully integrated within ourselves. We react with disproportionate emotion, with visceral repulsion or fascination, to those aspects we have exiled to our inner darkness. I call this projection, and it is the mechanism by which we turn the world into a mirror of our internal conflicts. You are not seeing others clearly when you judge them with intensity. You are seeing your own rejected qualities reflected back at you, distorted by the lens of denial. This is why your most bitter enemy is often your greatest teacher. The people who disturbed you most reveal the parts of yourself you've worked hardest to bury. The colleague whose arrogance infuriates you may mirror your own hidden hunger for recognition that you've deemed unacceptable. The friend whose neediness exhausts you might reflect your own deep longing for connection that you've armored against. The stranger whose weakness disgusts you could be showing you the vulnerability you spent a lifetime refusing to acknowledge in yourself. I observed this pattern repeatedly in my practice. A patient once came to me consumed with rage toward his brother's selfishness. For months, he catalogued every instance of his brother's self-centered behavior, building an ironclad case for his contempt. Yet when we explored his own life, a different picture emerged. This man had sacrificed everything for others, his career ambitions, his personal desires, his very sense of self. He had made himself into a martyr, and the weight of that false nobility was crushing him. What he truly hated in his brother was the freedom to choose oneself, a freedom he had forbidden himself to even desire. His brother's selfishness was a mirror reflecting back the self-abandonment he could not consciously acknowledge. To admit his brother might simply be honoring his own needs would mean confronting the terrible price of his own self-denial. This is the machinery of projection. We cannot tolerate in others what we cannot integrate in ourselves. And so we wage wars against external enemies while the real battle rages unacknowledged within. The shadow grows stronger in darkness, fed by every act of denial, every judgment we cast outward to avoid looking inward. But here is what few understand. The shadow does not seek to destroy you. It seeks to be recognized, acknowledged, integrated. Those rejected parts of yourself are not evil, they are exiled. They pound on the doors of consciousness not to bring chaos, but to be allowed back home. Your anger wants to protect your boundaries. Your selfishness wants to honor your legitimate needs. Your weakness wants to let you rest. Your darkness wants to give you depth. Your pride wants to protect your dignity. Your anger wants to defend your boundaries. Consider this carefully. When someone mistreats you and you feel that surge of indignation, that hot, righteous anger, what is really happening? Society tells you to swallow it, to be the bigger person, to turn the other cheek until your neck is sore from turning. But your anger knows something important. It knows that your boundaries matter. It knows that you are not a doormat, not a receptacle for other people's cruelty or carelessness. I once worked with a man who prided himself on never getting angry. "I'm very calm," he told me. "Nothing bothers me." But as we spoke, I noticed his hands trembled slightly. He had migraines that left him bedridden for days. His stomach was a knot of ulcers. His body was screaming what his mouth refused to say. "I am being violated, and I will not defend myself." His unspoken anger had turned inward, like a snake eating its own tail. Because he would not let himself feel anger toward those who harmed him, his anger found the only available target, himself. This is what happens when we exile our anger. It does not disappear. It goes underground and wages guerrilla warfare against our own flesh. Your anger is not your enemy. It is your boundary guard, standing watch at the gates of your selfhood. When someone crosses a line, your anger raises a flag and says, "Here. No further." Without it, you become borderless, a country anyone can invade without consequence. The same is true of pride. We've made pride into a sin, something to confess and eliminate. But what is healthy pride except the recognition of your own worth? When you do something well, when you overcome a challenge, when you remain true to yourself under pressure, should you pretend you didn't? Should you minimize and diminish yourself to make others comfortable? I've watched people apologize for their successes, downplay their talents, hide their light under baskets stacked so high they can barely breathe underneath. They call this humility. I call it self-betrayal. True humility is not thinking less of yourself. It is thinking of yourself less. But that requires first having a self you respect, a self you are proud to be. Your pride wants to say, "I matter. What I do matters. I will not pretend to be less than I am." This is not arrogance. Arrogance is insecurity wearing a crown. Pride is dignity standing upright. Pride is not shouting your worth from the rooftops. It is the quiet certainty that needs no validation. It is the artist who paints in solitude, never sharing a single canvas, because the act itself is the reward. It is the craftsman who pours months into a single piece, knowing that most will never understand the care embedded in each detail. The world mistakes pride for ego because it cannot distinguish between the man who loves himself and the man who fears himself. The ego shouts. Pride whispers. The ego demands recognition. Pride requires nothing but its own approval. I have watched people diminish themselves in the name of humility, shrinking to fit into boxes built by those who fear expansion. They apologize for their achievements. They downplay their gifts. They learn to make themselves small so that others feel comfortable. And they wonder why life feels suffocating. You were not born to make others comfortable with your light. You were born to shine so brightly that they remember they, too, are made of fire. Consider the eagle. It does not apologize for its wings. It does not fly lower to accommodate the sparrow. It soars because that is its nature. And in its soaring, it reminds every creature that reaches upward as possible. Your excellence is not a rebuke to others. It is an invitation. But here is where pride becomes sacred, when it extends beyond the self. Personal pride becomes collective dignity. When you honor yourself, you create a template for how others might honor themselves. When you refuse to accept mediocrity in your own life, you give permission for others to demand more from theirs. The family that takes pride in its lineage passes down not just names, but values. Standards. A way of being in the world. The community that takes pride in its culture preserves what would otherwise dissolve into homogeneity. Pride is the guardian at the gate of identity. We have been taught to be ashamed of pride in heritage, in ancestry, in roots. As if remembering where we come from is somehow an insult to where others have been. This is madness. A tree does not apologize for its roots. It draws strength from them. It reaches higher because it is anchored deeper. And so too must you anchor yourself in acceptance, not of inadequacy, but of wholeness. The shadow is not your enemy. It is your teacher. And the lesson it teaches is this: you are not half light and half dark. You are complete. Every impulse, every fear, every shameful thought, they are not aberrations. They are voices in the great council of your psyche, each demanding to be heard. When you silence them, they grow louder in other ways. They manifest as symptoms, compulsions, obsessions, sudden irrational angers. A man who denies his aggression becomes passive-aggressive, his violence leaking out in sarcasm, in sabotage, in cold withdrawal. A woman who suppresses her ambition becomes bitter, resentful of others' success, poisoned by the very desire she refuses to acknowledge. But when you give the shadow a seat at the table, when you allow it to speak without judgment, something miraculous occurs. It loses its tyranny. The monster becomes a messenger. I have seen this transformation countless times. A patient comes to me consumed by jealousy, tortured by it, ashamed of it. We do not try to destroy the jealousy. We ask it, "What are you protecting? What do you want?" And beneath the jealousy, we find longing. We find a deep hunger for connection, for recognition, for love. The jealousy was not the disease. It was the symptom of an unmet need. When we honor that need, when we give it language and space, the jealousy transforms. It becomes motivation, discernment, self-advocacy. The same energy that once corroded now creates. This is the alchemy of the psyche. Not elimination, but transformation. Not repression, but integration. You see, the goal is not to become good by eradicating the bad. The goal is to become whole by embracing all. The self, the true self, not the ego's narrow version, is a union of opposites. It contains both creation and destruction, order and chaos, mercy and severity. In mythology, the gods who possess only one quality are weak, limited. But the great gods, Zeus, Odin, Shiva, they contain multitudes. They are loving fathers and terrible destroyers. They create worlds and end them. Their power comes not from purity, but from integration. You are no different. Your power lies not in perfecting a single virtue, but in harmonizing the full symphony of your being. And this symphony requires all instruments, even the ones that play in minor keys. But integration is not a passive acceptance. It is not simply saying, "This is who I am, take it or leave it." No, integration is an active process of transformation. It is alchemy. Consider the medieval alchemists. They were not merely trying to turn lead into gold, though many believed they were. The true alchemists understood that the metal was a symbol. The lead represented the base aspects of human nature, the fears, the resentments, the petty jealousies. The gold represented the purified self, the integrated personality. The process they called the asterisk opus, the great work. It required fire, dissolution, separation, conjunction. In psychological terms, this means you must first bring your shadow into the light. You must examine it, not with judgment, but with curiosity. You must ask, why does this exist in me? What purpose does it serve? What does it protect? I once worked with a man who was praised throughout his community for his generosity. He gave freely to charities, helped his neighbors, never refused a request. Yet in our sessions, he confessed to a burning resentment that consumed him from within. He hated those he helped. He saw them as weak, as parasites. At first, he was horrified by these feelings. What kind of monster am I? He asked. I help people, yet I despise them for needing help. But as we explored deeper, we discovered something crucial. His generosity was not born from compassion. It was born from a terror of being seen as selfish. His father had been a cruel, miserly man, and he had vowed to be nothing like him. So he swung to the opposite extreme, denying his own needs, his own boundaries, until the suppressed self erupted as hatred. The integration required him to acknowledge a difficult truth, that he had a right to say no. That self-preservation is not selfishness. That true generosity flows from fullness, not from fear. When he began to honor his own limits, something remarkable happened. His resentment diminished, and paradoxically, his generosity became more authentic. He helped fewer people, but he helped them genuinely, without the undercurrent of contempt. This is the paradox of integration. When you stop rejecting parts of yourself, you become more whole. And wholeness does not mean perfection, it means authenticity. You have lived so long believing you are only the light. But tell me, have you not felt the pull of something deeper? Have you not had moments when anger surprised you, when jealousy crept in uninvited, when cruelty whispered at the edges of your kindness? These are not invasions from outside. They are residents within you, knocking on locked doors. What would happen if you opened those doors? Not to unleash chaos, but to acknowledge what has always been there. I will tell you what happens. You become less fragile, less afraid, less dependent on the approval of others to tell you who you are. You see, when you deny your shadow, you give it power over you. It controls you from the basement of your psyche. But when you acknowledge it, when you turn toward it with curiosity rather than fear, something remarkable occurs. The shadow begins to lose its compulsive grip. The rage that once exploded without warning becomes assertiveness. The envy that poisoned your relationships transforms into motivation. The selfishness you were taught to hate reveals itself as necessary self-preservation. This is not moral relativism. I am not telling you that all behaviors are acceptable. I am telling you that all feelings are valid, all impulses are informative, and all aspects of your nature deserve to be understood. There is a difference between acknowledging a dark impulse and acting on it. Between feeling anger and causing harm. Between recognizing your capacity for cruelty and choosing kindness anyway. In fact, I would argue that true morality is impossible without shadow work. How can you be genuinely kind if you have never met your capacity for cruelty? How can you be truly courageous if you have never faced your cowardice? How can you love fully if you have never acknowledged your hatred? The persona shows the world a curated version of you. The shadow holds everything the persona rejects. But you, the real you, exist in the integration of both. This is why so many spiritual seekers fail. They mistake transcendence for avoidance. They climb toward the light while their shadows grow longer beneath them, unexamined and unintegrated. Eventually, the shadow always catches up. It must. It is part of you. And when it does, the fall is devastating, because they have built their entire identity on being above such things. This is why the most dangerous person in any room is often the one who insists they have nothing to hide. The person who claims total transparency, total control, who performs their virtue with theatrical precision. Behind that performance lies a pressure cooker of denied material, waiting for a single crack in the facade. I have watched politicians caught in scandals they once condemned with righteous fury. I have seen spiritual teachers exposed for the very appetites they spent decades preaching against. The religious leader obsessed with the sins of others often wrestles with those exact sins in private. The activist who crusades against a particular corruption may be projecting their own unacknowledged complicity. This pattern is not coincidence. It is psychological law. The more energy we invest in denying a part of ourselves, the more powerful it becomes. The shadow does not diminish through rejection, it grows. It accumulates force in the darkness, feeding on our attention even as we claim to ignore it. Every time we say, I would never, we are actually saying, I am terrified I might. And here is what makes this truly treacherous. The shadow is patient. It does not need to overthrow you tomorrow. It can wait years, decades even, gathering strength while you build your towers of identity higher and higher. It watches as you construct elaborate belief systems designed specifically to keep it locked away. It observes your every defense mechanism, learning them, understanding them. Then it strikes when you are most convinced of your own righteousness, when you believe you have finally transcended your base nature. That is when the slip happens. The private email that becomes public. The moment of rage caught on camera. The addiction that can no longer be hidden. The affair that shatters the image of the perfect marriage. The fall from grace is always most dramatic for those who climbed highest while refusing to look down. But it does not have to be this way. The alternative is not to indulge every dark impulse. That is simply shadow possession by another name. The alternative is recognition, acknowledgement, integration. When you integrate the shadow, something extraordinary happens. The energy you spent on repression becomes available for living. The tension that created your symptoms dissolves. You don't become perfect, you become whole. I've seen this transformation countless times. The rigid moralist who acknowledges his capacity for selfishness doesn't become selfish, he becomes compassionate. He understands human frailty because he's faced his own. The person who's always been nice, who finally acknowledges their anger, doesn't become cruel, they become honest. They develop boundaries. They stop being a doormat while resenting everyone who walks across them. This is the paradox of shadow work. Acknowledging your darkness doesn't make you darker. It makes you more conscious. And consciousness is the antidote to acting out what you refuse to see. Let me be concrete about what integration actually looks like. It's not a single dramatic moment. It's a series of small recognitions. You catch yourself judging someone and pause to ask, what part of myself am I seeing in them? You feel an emotion you usually suppress, maybe envy, maybe lust, maybe rage, and instead of immediately pushing it away, you observe it. You get curious about it. Where does this come from? What is it trying to tell me? You begin to separate feeling from action. This is crucial. Acknowledging that you feel attracted to someone other than your partner doesn't mean you act on it. But denying the feeling entirely creates a pressure that can eventually explode. Acknowledging your capacity for violence doesn't make you violent, it makes you responsible for that capacity. You become the guardian of your own darkness rather than its unconscious servant. Integration means developing what I call relationship with your shadow. You talk to it. You listen to it. When it shows up in your dreams as the threatening figure, the seductress, the monster, you don't just run. You turn around. You ask what it wants, what it needs. Often, the shadow carries qualities you actually need. The overly rational person whose shadow contains emotion. The people pleaser whose shadow contains healthy selfishness. The timid person whose shadow contains aggression, not violence, but the capacity to assert, to fight for what matters, to say no. I have seen this pattern countless times in my work with patients. The moment they begin to recognize and integrate these shadow aspects, their energy changes. The depression that had plagued them for years begins to lift, not because they've eliminated their darkness, but because they've stopped fighting it. The anxiety that kept them paralyzed begins to transform into alertness, into discernment. And here is what always surprises them. They do not become worse people. They become more complete, more human. The rational person who acknowledges their emotions does not become a weeping wreck. They become someone who can think and feel, who can bring both logic and compassion to their decisions. The people pleaser who embraces healthy selfishness does not become cruel. They become someone who can give from genuine generosity rather than fearful obligation. This is the great paradox of shadow work. By accepting what we feared would destroy us, we become stronger. By integrating what we thought was evil, we become more good, not the pale, anemic goodness of repression, but the robust goodness of someone who has faced their capacity for darkness and chosen light anyway. But let me be clear about what this integration actually looks like in practice, because this is where many people become confused. Integrating your shadow does not mean acting on every impulse. It does not mean you acknowledge your anger and therefore start screaming at everyone who annoys you. It does not mean you recognize your selfishness and therefore become a narcissist. Integration means consciousness. It means you feel your anger without being controlled by it. You acknowledge it. Yes, I am angry. This matters to me. This boundary has been crossed. And from that acknowledgement, you can choose how to respond. Sometimes the appropriate response is indeed to express that anger clearly and firmly. Sometimes it is to recognize that the anger is disproportionate, that it's touching an old wound, and to address the wound rather than the present situation. The integrated person has access to their full range of human experience and can choose consciously which aspect to bring forward in any given moment. They have not eliminated the shadow, they have made it available, workable, useful. This is what I mean when I speak of wholeness. Not perfection, but completeness. Not the elimination of darkness, but its integration into a larger, more conscious totality. I have watched people spend decades in analysis, peeling back layer after layer of defense, only to discover at the center not some pristine core of light, but the full spectrum of human capacity, the ability to create and destroy, to love and to hate, to heal and to harm. And this discovery, far from being devastating, becomes liberating. Because once you stop pretending you are only one thing, you can finally choose, moment by moment, who you wish to become. The shadow does not disappear through integration. It transforms from something that controls you unconsciously into something you can work with consciously. The rage is still there, but you are no longer its puppet. The envy remains, but it no longer poisons your relationships. The cruelty exists, but you choose not to enact it. This is the paradox that few understand. You become good not by denying your capacity for evil, but by fully acknowledging it. The person who insists they could never hurt anyone is far more dangerous than the one who admits, yes, I could hurt someone, and that is precisely why I must remain vigilant. I think of a patient I worked with years ago, a physician, a healer by profession, beloved by his patients. He came to me because he was having intrusive thoughts of violence, visions of harming the very people he was sworn to protect. He was horrified by these images, convinced they revealed him as a monster. But as we explored these visions together, we discovered they were not omens of future violence. They were his psyche's way of forcing him to acknowledge the power he held. Every day, this man made life and death decisions. Every day, he cut into human flesh with knives. And yet he had constructed an identity as purely benevolent, purely good. His shadow was demanding acknowledgement. You are not just a healer. You are someone who wields immense power. Recognize this. Respect this. Once he could admit to himself that he held both the capacity to heal and the capacity to harm, the intrusive thoughts ceased. Not because they were eliminated, but because they had served their purpose. They had forced consciousness where there had been only a pleasant fiction. The shadow does not vanish when acknowledged. It transforms. It becomes less adversary, more companion. Less monster in the closet, more truth-teller in the mirror. I recall a woman who came to me tormented by dreams of infidelity. Night after night, she betrayed her husband in vivid, shameful detail. She woke each morning drowning in guilt for crimes uncommitted. Her conscious mind recoiled. I would never, she insisted. I love my husband. These dreams sicken me. But I asked her not what the dreams meant about her marriage, but what they revealed about herself. What hunger went unfed? What part of her had been sacrificed at the altar of respectability? Through our work, she discovered not that she wanted to betray her husband, but that she had betrayed herself. She had pruned away her spontaneity, her playfulness, her appetite for adventure. She had become so committed to being the dutiful wife that she had forgotten how to be herself. The dreams were not prophecy. They were protest. The shadow was not encouraging destruction but demanding integration. Once she began reclaiming those lost parts, taking dance classes, traveling alone, pursuing old creative passions, the dreams transformed. The sexual imagery faded. The guilt dissolved. This is the paradox the modern mind cannot grasp. By refusing the shadow, you empower it. By accepting it, you defame it. The intrusive thought loses its power not when you banish it, but when you sit down across from it and ask, "What are you truly trying to tell me?" Most of the time, the answer surprises you. The violent thought is not about violence but about the violence you do to yourself by remaining silent. The sexual thought is not about depravity but about the parts of your vitality you have repressed. The apocalyptic fantasy is not about destruction but about your desperate need for transformation. Your psyche speaks in symbols because the conscious mind would reject the message if delivered plainly. So it wraps truth in nightmare. It disguises medicine as poison. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of all. That your nightmares are acts of love. They are the psyche's brutal compassion. The soul's refusal to let you sleep through your own life. Think of it this way. If someone you loved deeply was walking toward a cliff in their sleep, would you whisper gently? Or would you scream? Would you shake them violently awake, even if it frightened them? The nightmare chooses violence because gentleness has failed. You have ignored the whispers. The subtle signs. The quiet dissatisfaction. The small betrayals of yourself that accumulated like dust until they buried you alive. So the psyche escalates. It sends you falling, drowning, being chased by shapeless terrors. It strips you naked in public squares. It kills those you love. It shows you your teeth crumbling into sand. Not because it hates you. Because it loves you too much to let you continue on this path. The nightmare is an intervention. A psychological emergency brake. And yes, it is terrifying. Yes, it leaves you gasping in the dark at 3 in the morning, heart pounding, sheets damp with sweat. But that terror is purposeful. It forces you to pay attention, to stop, to ask the question you have been avoiding. What am I doing to myself? I have watched people spend years in therapy trying to eliminate their nightmares. They want techniques, strategies, medications to make the bad dreams stop. And I understand the impulse. Who would not want peace? But they are asking the wrong question. The question is not how to stop the nightmares. The question is, what are they trying to tell me that I refuse to hear in daylight? When you understand this, when you truly grasp it, your relationship with your own unconscious transforms completely. You stop seeing nightmares as attacks and begin seeing them as communications. Difficult communications, yes. Uncomfortable, even painful, but communications nonetheless. From a part of you that knows you better than you know yourself. That sees what you refuse to see. That loves you enough to terrify you into consciousness. This is the gift hidden inside the nightmare. Not comfort, not peace, truth. Difficult, necessary, life-altering truth. And once you learn to receive that truth, once you develop the courage to face what your nightmares are showing you, something remarkable happens. They begin to change. They begin to change, not because the unconscious has been defeated or silenced, but because it has been heard. The dream content shifts. The recurring nightmare that tormented you for months suddenly stops appearing, or it transforms into something less terrifying, something more instructive. The monster that chased you through endless corridors now stands still, waiting to be recognized. The house that was always burning becomes a house that can be rebuilt. This transformation is not symbolic poetry. It is psychological fact. I have witnessed it hundreds of times in my practice. A patient who faces what their nightmares reveal, who integrates the shadow rather than fleeing from it, experiences measurable change not only in their dream life but in their waking existence. Their anxiety decreases. Their relationships improve. They make decisions with greater clarity and confidence. Because they are no longer at war with themselves. Let me be direct about something that modern culture desperately needs to understand. Your nightmares are not evidence that something is wrong with you. They are evidence that something is trying to become right. They are the immune response of a healthy psyche attempting to restore balance to a life that has drifted into dangerous territory. When you have a fever, your body is not malfunctioning. It is fighting. When you have a nightmare, your psyche is not broken. It is working precisely as it should, bringing to your attention what your conscious mind has been too afraid or too distracted to acknowledge. The question is not whether you will have nightmares. If you are living unconsciously, if you are suppressing parts of yourself, if you are avoiding necessary truths, then nightmares are inevitable. The question is whether you will listen to them. And listening requires something that our comfortable modern world has largely abandoned: the willingness to sit with discomfort, to face the dark, to descend into the underworld of your own psyche without guarantee of safe return. This is hero's work. Not the hero of action movies and comic books, but the real hero, the psychological hero who ventures into the unknown territories of their own soul and returns with wisdom. Your nightmares are the call to that adventure.